My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 33 years old, and the night my mother decided to humiliate me at Christmas dinner, she did it with a smile so polished it could have passed for kindness. She lifted her wine glass, looked straight at me, and said, "Your sister just bought a beautiful house. A real house. Isn't that wonderful? Maybe next Christmas you'll finally be ready to settle down too." The whole table laughed the way people do when they think they're watching a harmless family joke, and across from me, my sister leaned back in her chair with that little satisfied smirk I'd known since childhood. "Yeah," she said, dragging out the word like she was speaking to a teenager instead of a grown woman. "When are you going to stop drifting and start building a real life?" I remember setting my fork down very carefully, because when you've spent years learning how not to explode in front of people who enjoy testing your dignity, you get good at small, precise movements. Then I smiled. Not the wounded smile they expected. Not the embarrassed one they'd trained me into wearing. A calm one. "I already did," I said. "I just didn't invite anyone who doubts me." My sister's face went still. My mother blinked. And in the silence that followed, I realized something wonderful. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being measured at that table. Before I tell you what happened next, and why that one sentence changed everything, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. To understand why that one sentence hit the table like a dropped glass, you need to understand the role I had been assigned in my family long before that Christmas. In my mother's version of events, my younger sister was the daughter who made sense. She had the milestones people recognized instantly and praised without needing explanation. She had the polished job title, the carefully staged relationship, the tidy social media life, and now, finally, a house with a front door my mother could point at like proof she had raised at least one daughter the right way. I was the daughter who required context, and my mother hated context. She hated anything that could not be summed up in one sentence at church, at brunch, or over the phone with relatives she secretly competed with. So instead of describing my life accurately, she simplified it until it sounded unserious. She'd say I worked with old furniture. No, as if I spent my days dusting thrift store cabinets instead of restoring estate pieces, consulting on historic interiors, and running a specialized business people booked months in advance. She'd say I liked the quiet life, which was her way of translating discipline into social deficiency. She'd say I was still finding myself. Even after I had built a client list, hired part-time help during peak seasons, and started earning more than anyone in the family had expected from me. The truth was less convenient for her. I didn't stumble into my career. I built it from nothing, and built it the hard way. While other people were working clean office jobs in climate-controlled buildings, I was in workshops at dawn learning wood grain, veneer repair, custom staining, and structural restoration. I learned how to tell when a chair only looked broken and when it actually was. I learned how to price labor no one respected until they saw the final result. I learned how to negotiate with collectors, how to handle wealthy clients who assumed a woman working with her hands would be grateful for being underpaid, and how to stand my ground when people mistook craftsmanship for hobbyism. There's a specific kind of arrogance people bring to trades they don't understand. I met it often. I also beat it often. But in my family, none of that carried the same weight as a neat milestone with good curb appeal. My sister Vanessa understood that very early. She had a talent I didn't. She knew how to convert ordinary life events into family theater. A promotion became a celebration dinner. A dating anniversary became a weekend trip everyone had to hear about. A couch delivery became, "We're really building a life now." She wasn't smarter than me or kinder than me. She was simply fluent in the language my mother loved most, visible achievement packaged for admiration, and because she knew it worked, She used it. Not with open cruelty at first. With a smile. With little remarks. With that polished tone women use when they want to insult you and still look elegant doing it. If I skipped a holiday because of work, she'd say, "Claire's too free-spirited for schedules." If I showed up tired from finishing a commission, she'd say, "That self-employed life seems exhausting. I could never handle that uncertainty." If someone complimented my work, she'd smile and add, "Yes, Claire's always been so creative. We just keep hoping she turns it into something more permanent." She made me sound like an unfinished art project. My mother made me sound like a concern. Together, they created a version of me that relatives accepted without ever checking against reality. And for too many years, I let them. Not because I believed them exactly, but because correcting people all the time is exhausting. There is a particular fatigue that comes from having to introduce yourself twice, once as you are, and once again after your family has summarized you badly. After a while, I stopped explaining. I let them underestimate me because fighting every comment felt desperate and silence felt more dignified. But silence has a cost. If you stay quiet long enough, some people mistake your restraint for agreement. They start thinking the small box they've put you in must be accurate, because surely you'd object if it weren't. That Christmas, my mother thought she was comparing her two daughters. In reality, she was comparing my visible absence from her fantasy with my sister's perfect obedience to it. What she didn't know was that while she had been narrating me as unsettled, I had already done the most grounded thing I had ever done in my life. 6 months earlier, I had bought an old boarding house on the coast of Maine. Not because it was practical on paper, because it was mine in my bones the moment I saw it. It was weather-beaten, sea-worn, and full of expensive problems that would have scared off anyone who wanted instant approval. The porch sagged. The upstairs hallway smelled faintly of salt and old cedar. The windows rattled in the wind. Half the rooms looked like they had been forgotten on purpose. And I loved it immediately. I didn't see decay when I walked through it. I saw shape. I saw history. I saw a workshop on the first floor with enough space for custom builds and restorations. I saw a modest apartment upstairs with morning light in the kitchen. I saw guest rooms I could slowly turn into a retreat space for artists and makers who needed quiet and time. I saw the exact kind of future that would never impress my mother until it was finished enough for photographs. And that was part of why I kept it to myself. I was tired of being discussed while I was still in the process of becoming. I wanted one thing in my life to grow without commentary, without comparison, without my sister asking questions in that falsely casual tone she used when she was hunting for flaws. I wanted one joy that belonged entirely to me before the family got their hands on it. By Christmas, the roof repairs were done, the main staircase was safe, my workshop was operational, and I had spent enough nights there to know the sound of the wind against every side of the house. I had chosen paint colors, repaired cracked trim, refinished doors, installed better locks, and stood alone in the kitchen one freezing morning realizing I had never felt more certain of anything. I was not drifting. I was rooted in a way my family had never bothered to imagine. They just hadn't been invited to see it. The hardest part about being underestimated by strangers is proving them wrong. The hardest part about being underestimated by family is realizing they may not want to be corrected. My mother's story about me had never been accidental. It was useful. It made her feel organized. It preserved the family hierarchy she preferred. Vanessa was the reassuring daughter. Recognizable, presentable, easy to brag about. I was the complicated one, talented enough to mention, but never in a way that threatened the ranking. My mother didn't say these things directly because directness can be confronted. She worked in subtler materials, tone, framing, omission. She'd praise me in ways that reduced me at the same time. "Claire's so independent," she'd say, which sounds flattering until you hear the implication. Alone, difficult, outside normal life. Claire's always done her own thing, which really meant uncontrollable. Claire isn't very traditional, which in our family was code for not reassuring enough to display. My sister learned from the best. Vanessa never openly attacked me in a way anyone else could easily condemn. She specialized in elegant dismissal. She would ask questions that sounded supportive but were built to weaken. Do you have benefits? Is that kind of income seasonal? What happens if clients stop coming? Do you ever worry you're investing too much in something so niche? She said these things in front of other people lightly, as if she were simply curious. But her timing was always strategic, never when I was struggling privately. Always when someone had just complimented me, always when attention had landed in my direction for a second too long. When I was 26 and landed a contract to restore pieces for a historic inn renovation, she asked at Thanksgiving whether I was finally done experimenting. When I was 29 and had my busiest year yet, my mother told an aunt that I was still piecing together a path. When I turned 31 and started consulting with designers who sent me repeat work, Vanessa laughed over coffee and said, "I mean, it's impressive in a quirky way. I just could never live with that much uncertainty." She said it while showing me backsplash samples for a condo she hadn't even bought yet. That was Vanessa's gift. She could make aspiration sound like accomplishment and make actual accomplishment sound provisional. At some point, I stopped expecting fairness and started studying the pattern. My mother needed the family to revolve around visible symbols of success because those symbols reflected back on her. My sister needed my supposed instability because it sharpened her image as the dependable one. It wasn't just affection, it was structure. If I suddenly became undeniable, the whole emotional economy of the family changed. My mother would have to admit she had misread me for years. Vanessa would lose her favorite mirror. And people rarely surrender a flattering story about themselves without resistance. That's why the house mattered so much to Vanessa, beyond the actual purchase. She talked about it like it was a crown, not a property. Every conversation in the months leading up to Christmas circled back to it. The countertops, the school district, even though she had no children, the guest room wallpaper, the backyard potential, the neighborhood character. She sent listing photos to the family group chat and waited for reactions like a performer waiting for applause. My mother responded exactly as expected. "So proud of you. Such a mature step. This is what building a future looks like." Then, because nothing in our house was complete without comparison, she would call me separately and deliver the translation. "You know, Vanessa has always been very focused. It's nice to see one of you making these decisions. I hope this inspires you, sweetheart." Inspires me to do what? Purchase a life selected for its readability? Trade my workshop for a breakfast nook I didn't want? Become legible to people who only respected what they already understood? The absurdity of it might have been funny if it weren't so constant. Still, I won't pretend I felt nothing. Repeated dismissal shapes you even when you outgrow believing it. There were nights in my 20s when I lay awake wondering whether my mother was right, whether I had confused courage with refusal, whether choosing a life that fit me but impressed no one was secretly a form of failure. That's the kind of damage family does best. Not always by breaking your confidence outright, but by inserting doubt in your private voice. It took years to separate my truth from their commentary, years to understand that my work was solid, my instincts were sound, and my life did not become lesser because it wasn't easy to summarize at holiday dinners. By the time I bought the boarding house, I wasn't trying to prove them wrong anymore. That's important. I didn't make that purchase as revenge. I made it because it fit the architecture of who I already was. But once I had it, once I walked through those rooms and saw what my life looked like without their narration sitting on top of it, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. They had never been evaluating me accurately. They had been defending a story, and people defending a story often become crueler when the truth arrives calmly. That's what made Christmas dangerous. Not because I feared exposure, because I knew exposure was coming for them. I almost stayed in Maine that year. The snow had started early, the workshop was full, and I had enough legitimate reasons to avoid family dinner that no one could have blamed me. A dining table piled with old resentments is nobody's idea of festive, but 3 days before Christmas, my grandmother called. She never wasted words, which was one reason I trusted her more than anyone. "Are you going home?" she asked. I was standing at the long work table in my workshop, sanding the edge of a restored cabinet door, looking out through the back window at the frozen grass and the line of gray Atlantic sky beyond it. "I haven't decided," I said. "Then decide one thing first," she replied. "If you go, don't go to be judged. Go already knowing who you are." That sounds simple, but it wasn't. For years, family gatherings had a way of rearranging me. I'd drive there feeling competent and leave feeling vaguely unfinished, as if my accomplishments had somehow become harder to trust simply because they weren't reflected back properly across that table. My grandmother knew that. She knew the real danger was never the jokes themselves. It was the old reflex they awakened, the impulse to defend myself too much, to explain too carefully, to shrink so the room could stay comfortable. She was also the only one in the family who knew about the boarding house. I had shown it to her in September, a week after closing. The weather that day had been cold and bright. I picked her up from the train station and drove her north, nervous in a way that surprised me. Not because I thought she would judge me, because I cared whether she saw what I saw. We pulled up to the house just after noon, the ocean wind snapping at our coats, the front steps still uneven, half the downstairs smelling of old plaster and cedar. Most people would have seen cost, labor, delay. My grandmother stood in the foyer, looked around at the cracked trim, the broad staircase, the old pegs on the wall where fishermen's coats must have hung decades earlier, and smiled like she was greeting someone with character. "This place has survived," she said softly. "I like that about it." Then she turned to me and added, "You chose well." She walked through every room slowly, asking practical questions, not performative ones. What was structurally urgent? Which rooms would wait? How much could I do myself? Where would the workshop go? Had I budgeted a cushion for surprises? That was love from her, respect in the form of serious attention, not flattery, not vague support, recognition. She sat on an overturned crate in what is now my studio and listened while I explained my plan to restore the guest rooms one by one, eventually hosting small seasonal retreats for artists, woodworkers, bookbinders, people who needed quiet and didn't want a curated lifestyle brand pretending to offer it. She didn't once ask why I hadn't told my mother. She understood before I said it. Because sharing unfinished joy with the wrong people can feel like placing wet paint in the path of careless hands. By Christmas week, 3 downstairs rooms were finished, the kitchen worked, and the upstairs apartment finally felt inhabited instead of improvised. I had curtains up in the bedroom, books stacked by the sofa, and a chipped blue mug I always used in the morning because it fit perfectly in my hand while I checked invoices before sunrise. I had repaired enough of the porch to stand out there with coffee and watch the winter water without worrying the boards would give under me. There was still plenty left to do, but the house no longer felt like a project. It felt like a life already underway. The morning I drove to Connecticut, I locked my own front door and stood there for a second in the cold, key in hand, looking back through the front window at the lamp I'd left on in the sitting room. It's hard to explain how grounding that felt. For so many years, family visits had carried the emotional threat of making me question myself. This time, I was leaving from something solid. I had a mortgage in my name, contracts on my desk, tools in my workshop, and salt in the air outside my own walls. Their opinions could still sting, but they could no longer define the facts. My parents' house looked exactly the same when I arrived. Warm lights in the windows, ribbon too perfect to have been tied by anyone spontaneous. My mother's version of hospitality displayed with military precision. She opened the door with a bright expression that lasted all of 2 seconds before turning managerial. "Claire, there you are. Traffic?" she asked, then noticed my boots. "Honestly, you always look like you came in from fixing a dock." I was still taking off my gloves. It took less than 10 seconds. "I came from home," I said. She barely heard me because Vanessa swept in from the living room wearing cream cashmere and triumph. "You made it," she said, air kissing my cheek. "Perfect timing. Mom was just telling everyone about the closing." Of course she was. My older sister Megan came up behind her carrying a tray and murmured, "It's already unbearable," before moving on. That told me everything. The night had already chosen its center. My father hugged me in the distracted way men do when they sense tension and hope affection can count as neutrality. My grandmother, seated near the fire, gave me one long look and the slightest nod. "Don't shrink." Message received. As I hung my coat, I could feel the old machinery of the family beginning to turn. Conversations sorted themselves into familiar positions. Vanessa radiated the kind of satisfaction that only makes sense when it is being witnessed. My mother floated from group to group feeding the narrative. I was expected to occupy my usual place, warm enough to be acceptable, quiet enough to be manageable, successful only in ways that didn't disturb the ranking. But I had driven in with a house key in my pocket and a different spine than the one I used to bring home. I didn't feel defiant. I felt ready. And that was more dangerous. Dinner started with the usual choreography of a family that prefers symbolism to honesty. My mother had set the table beautifully, of course. Candles, silver, folded linen napkins, the good serving dishes she brought out when she wanted the evening to feel meaningful enough to be remembered later in photos. But even before we sat down, the real centerpiece wasn't the food. It was Vanessa's house. Every conversation found its way back there. The yard, the foyer, the natural light, the neighborhood, the future guest room. The original hardwood floors she spoke about as if she had personally rescued them from architectural extinction. My mother encouraged every detail with a kind of polished reverence that might have been touching if it hadn't been so deliberate. "That window seat is what sold me," she told an aunt, though she was not the one buying the place. "It just feels like a real grown woman home." Then, after everyone settled and the first wave of serving had passed, she lifted her glass and said, "I just want to say how proud I am. Watching Vanessa buy her first house has been such a comfort to me. There's something so reassuring about seeing one of your daughters truly settled. One of your daughters. Not subtle. Never fully explicit. But never subtle." A few people murmured agreement. My father nodded in that passive, weary way he used when he wanted the room calm more than he wanted it fair. Megan stared down at her plate. My cousin raised her eyebrows at me for half a second, just enough to say yes. I heard that too. I kept cutting my food into smaller pieces than I needed, which is something I do when I'm deciding whether a moment deserves my energy. Vanessa stepped in with false modesty exactly on cue. "Mom, stop," she said, smiling in that way that meant don't stop at all. "It's just a house." "No," my mother said warmly. "It's not just a house. It's responsibility, commitment, vision. It means something." Then came the pivot. I could hear it before she made it. My mother had always loved a comparison disguised as concern. She turned toward me with that expression she used when she wanted an audience to believe she was being gentle. "Claire, sweetheart, I hope you're not feeling pressured. Everyone has their own timing. We just worry sometimes. You're talented, of course, but talent and stability aren't the same thing." There it was, a whole lifetime in 2 sentences, praise used as softening foam around disrespect. Vanessa dabbed her lips with her napkin and joined in. I mean, Claire's always been more atmospheric than practical. She laughed a little, and a couple people did too, not because it was truly funny, but because family tables reward the confident speaker. You know what I mean? She's always moving from project to project. I looked at her then. Really looked. Perfect blouse, perfect manicure, perfect confidence, the kind built from years of being told she represented adulthood correctly. What she didn't realize was that she was speaking to someone who had spent the previous week meeting with electricians, reviewing renovation budgets, managing supply delays, and planning a spring booking calendar for a property she owned outright in name and reality. She thought she was mocking a drifting older sister. She was mocking a landowner while sitting in her mother's script. My mother pressed on, now enjoying herself. Your sister just bought a beautiful house, she announced again, louder this time so the far end of the table could fully participate in the comparison. A real house. I'm just curious, Claire. When will you finally settle down? Vanessa leaned back with that small, satisfied smirk I had known since adolescence. Yeah, she added. When are you going to stop floating around and start building a real life? That was the line. Not because it was the cruelest thing anyone had ever said to me, because it was so polished, so practiced, so rooted in a lie they had repeated for years that they no longer recognized it as one. It was an entire worldview condensed into a holiday taunt. I felt the room waiting for me to do what I had always done: smile awkwardly, deflect, let them keep the frame. Instead, I set my fork down carefully, touched my napkin once. Let the silence stretch just enough to make people look up. Then I smiled. I already did, I said. You could almost feel the air hesitate. Vanessa's expression didn't drop all at once. It stalled first, as though she expected the rest of my sentence to rescue her. My mother blinked, confused by the tone more than the words. What? She asked. I already settled down, I repeated calmly. I just didn't invite anyone who doubts me. This time, the silence landed harder. Someone at the far end of the table shifted in their chair. My father looked up fully now. Megan stopped pretending to eat. My grandmother lowered her glass and watched me with a stillness that felt like support. Vanessa gave a short laugh. What is that supposed to mean? It means, I said, that 6 months ago I bought a boarding house on the coast of Maine. I live there. I work there. I've been restoring it room by room. It's my home, my studio, and the foundation of the next phase of my business. That sentence changed the geometry of the room. My mother stared at me as if I had suddenly spoken a line from the wrong script. You bought a boarding house? She repeated, and even in her shock there was skepticism, as if the very shape of my success had offended her by refusing to be simple. Vanessa's face tightened. A boarding house? Claire, that's not the same as— No, I said before she could finish. It's not the same. You bought a house everyone can recognize in one glance. I bought a life that fits me. Those are different things. For the first time all evening, several people around the table looked at me, not as the family question mark, but as the person holding the only truthful sentence in the room. My mother tried to regain control immediately. Well, darling, that sounds like one of your projects, she said with a brittle smile. How lovely. But Vanessa bought a family home. I turned to her. And I bought a property with living quarters, a functioning workshop, guest space, revenue potential, and actual peace. I'm not sure why yours counts as adulthood and mine counts as atmosphere. That hit hard. Megan let out the smallest breath of approval. My cousin lowered her fork. Even my father looked like he wanted to say something and knew anything he said would reveal too much. Vanessa sat straighter. You've been hiding this for 6 months? I've been protecting it for 6 months, I said. There's a difference. Once the truth was on the table, the evening stopped being a celebration and became what it probably should have been years earlier, an exposure. Not of my life, of theirs. Because the minute I said I owned the property, everyone at that table had to reveal how they actually saw me. My mother did it first. "Well," she said, gathering herself with the rigid smile people use when they're trying to regain authority through tone. "I suppose that explains why you've been so secretive, though I do wish you'd told us. Families are meant to share these things." It was such a polished line that someone who didn't know her well might have mistaken it for reasonable. But I knew the machinery behind it. She wasn't hurt that I hadn't shared. She was offended that something significant had happened without passing through her first. She hadn't been able to frame it, rank it, or attach herself to it publicly. That was the injury. "Families are also meant to listen without reducing everything to a competition," I said. My mother's face changed at that. Not dramatically. Just enough for anyone paying attention to see that she had been answered, not misunderstood. Vanessa jumped in before the silence could settle too long. "Come on, Claire, don't make this into some big oppression story. You bought a fixer-upper. That's great. But it's not like Mom was wrong to say we're in different stages. There are some sentences that reveal more than the speaker intends. We're in different stages. As if my life existed on a delayed timeline and hers was the official model. As if adulthood were a single road and she had simply reached the approved marker first. I turned toward her. "Different from what? Different from your preferences? Different from Mom's ability to brag about it in one sentence? Different from the kind of life that makes people clap before dessert?" Vanessa laughed once, but there was strain in it now. "You always do this. You make everything philosophical when it's actually simple." "No," I said. "Simple is what you call something when complexity threatens your advantage." That landed harder than I expected. She opened her mouth and closed it again. My father shifted in his chair and cleared his throat. That old family signal meaning, "Let's all back away from the real thing." "Maybe we should calm down," he muttered. "Why?" Megan said quietly, and all eyes turned to her because Megan almost never entered the center of conflict unless she was sure. Why should Claire calm down after being used as a comparison point all evening? Mom asked her a question in front of everyone. She answered. My mother's head turned sharply. "Megan, don't." But Megan had clearly been storing years of restraint. "No, actually, let's. Because this has been going on forever. Every time Claire does something impressive, it gets translated into something vague. Every time Vanessa does something conventional, it becomes proof of character. You don't hear yourself, Mom, but everyone else does." That changed the room again. Support, once voiced, always does. It makes denial harder. Vanessa looked stunned, less by what Megan said than by the fact that someone had sided with me openly. "Oh, please," she snapped. "No one is attacking Claire. We just don't act like every quirky decision she makes is some groundbreaking accomplishment." Quirky. That word should not have mattered. But it did, because it perfectly captured the family strategy. Reduce, reframe, dismiss. Call the hard thing charming so you don't have to respect it. Call the serious thing unusual so you can avoid being threatened by it. "Quirky?" I repeated. "I bought commercial-grade equipment, renovated a multi-room coastal property, built a workshop, secured recurring clients, and created a sustainable business model around it. That's not quirky. It's infrastructure." Even my cousin let out a low wow at that. My mother tried to pivot into concern again, but the tone no longer worked. "Claire, sweetheart, no one is denying you've worked hard." "No," I said. "You just deny that my hard work qualifies as adulthood unless it resembles Vanessa's." Her mouth tightened. "That's not fair. It's exact." There's a moment in certain family arguments when the oldest pattern becomes visible all at once. You can almost watch people realizing this fight is not about tonight. It's about 20 smaller nights, 15 smaller insults, 10 years of framing, 3 decades of roles. That moment arrived then. My father looked tired in a way that suggested recognition. Megan looked angry, but not surprised. My grandmother looked like someone hearing the truth spoken in the room she had been waiting years for it to reach. Vanessa crossed her arms. So what? This is all because Mom said I bought a beautiful house? You couldn't just be happy for me? I almost admired the audacity of that. Recast the problem as my inability to celebrate her. Classic. I am happy for you, I said. I'm not happy about being used as your contrast color. That silenced even her for a beat. Then my mother said the one thing that made everything clearer than it had ever been. Honestly, Claire, if you wanted us to see your life differently, maybe you should have shared more. Maybe you shouldn't have kept disappearing into this separate world of yours. Separate world, as if privacy were betrayal, as if building something away from the family gaze were an act of aggression. I leaned back and looked at her. Really looked. I saw not only the woman who had criticized me that night, but the woman who had narrated me for years in rooms I wasn't in. The woman who had translated my ambition into instability because it made her more comfortable. The woman who could not imagine that withholding information from her might be an act of self-protection rather than disrespect. I kept it private, I said slowly, because every time I share something real, you minimize it or compare it to Vanessa. I wanted one achievement untouched by your ranking system. One place in my life that didn't get turned into family theater. That line hit the table and stayed there. No one moved for a second. Then my grandmother spoke. She's right. My mother actually stared at her. Mother. No, my grandmother said, her voice calm but sharp enough to stop everyone. She is right. You have spent years speaking about Claire as if she were unfinished because her life does not flatter your imagination. And now you're upset because she built something important without submitting it for inspection. Vanessa looked to my mother, and for the first time all evening, the two of them didn't look aligned. They looked exposed. That's the thing about unhealthy alliances. They feel strong until the moment they're named out loud. My father rubbed a hand across his forehead. Maybe there have been assumptions. Megan let out a dry laugh. That is an impressively gentle word for it. My mother's eyes were shining now, but I knew better than to mistake moisture for remorse. I have done everything for this family, she said, voice trembling. And now I'm being made into the villain because I'm proud of one daughter? No, I said quietly. You're being confronted because your pride always comes with a hierarchy. That was it. That was the center. Not that she loved Vanessa, that she needed love to be comparative, needed one child to shine against another, needed admiration to move through competition so she could manage it. Once I said that, even she seemed to understand that the sentence could not be folded away. After that, dinner didn't exactly end. It unraveled, which is different. A normal holiday dinner ends with dessert, lighter conversation, people helping in the kitchen, the tension dissolving into ritual. Ours lost the script entirely. My father attempted one weak redirection toward pie and coffee, but nobody really followed him. Vanessa sat in a silence so stiff it looked painful. My mother kept adjusting things that did not need adjusting. A serving spoon, a folded napkin, the placement of a candle. Which is what she does when control has left the room but her body hasn't accepted it yet. Megan started asking me practical questions about the property. Not in a rescuing way, but in a serious one. Square footage, distance from town, how much of the restoration I'd done myself. My cousin pulled up the area on her phone and said, "Claire, this place is stunning," with genuine surprise that made my mother visibly tense. Then my grandmother asked, "Are you happy there?" The room went quiet in a different way after that. Softer, more honest. Because that question had nothing to do with status, nothing to do with whether the property looked better in photos than Vanessa's house. It went straight to the thing my family had ignored for years. Did my life actually fit me? I pictured the house at dawn. The kitchen window fogged slightly from the kettle, the smell of wood and coffee and cold air. The scratch of my pencil across invoices before the workday started. The repaired staircase under my hand. The long table in the workshop where damaged things came back to themselves slowly. The ocean beyond the backlot. Never loud, always present. The feeling of unlocking my own door after a difficult day and knowing no one inside that house expected me to be anyone else. Yes, I said, I'm very happy there. And that answer did more for me than any defense I had made all evening. Because for years, part of me had still wanted my family to validate my choices before I could fully trust the joy inside them. That night, I understood I had already crossed that bridge. I didn't need them to understand my life in order for it to be real. Their misunderstanding was no longer a wound. It was just evidence of distance. Vanessa finally muttered, I still think keeping it secret was weird. I looked at her. Maybe, but not as weird as building your confidence around someone else staying underestimated. Megan actually laughed at that. My cousin tried not to. Vanessa's face went cold. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voice, no theatrical exit. Just the unmistakable expression of someone realizing the old method no longer worked. For the first time in our lives, she could not reposition me as lesser without sounding exactly like what she was. When dinner finally broke apart, people drifted into smaller conversations, but the emotional center of the night had already shifted permanently. I went to the hallway to get my coat, and as expected, my mother followed. She always preferred private correction after public failure. Her voice dropped low immediately. You embarrassed your sister. I buttoned my coat slowly. No, I said. I embarrassed the story you tell about me. She was standing too close to it. My mother's jaw tightened. Family does not do this to each other. That old line. Family as a shield against accountability. Family as the reason the person hurt is expected to remain gracious longer than the people doing the hurting. I had heard variations of it my whole life. Family also doesn't use one daughter's milestone to shame another, I said. At least not healthy family. You're twisting this. I'm naming it. That was what she hated most by the end. Not my tone, not my timing, not even the public contradiction. Naming. Once something is named clearly, it becomes harder to hide inside tradition, harder to excuse as personality, harder to pass off as concern. She looked at me for a long moment, and I could see her searching for the old version of me, the one who would soften, backtrack, apologize for making things awkward. But awkwardness had already done its job. It had forced honesty into the room. Before I opened the door, I said one last thing. You don't get to call it closeness when the price is my silence. Then I stepped out into the cold. The drive back to Maine the next morning felt completely different from every family drive home I had taken before. Usually after holidays, I replayed conversations, edited myself, wondered whether I had been too sensitive or too distant or too difficult. That time I felt clean, not happy exactly. Not triumphant in some loud revenge movie sense. Something better. Aligned. My phone buzzed twice before I even hit the highway. One message was from my mother, defensive and clipped, saying she hoped I understood how much stress I had caused. No apology, no curiosity, just reputation management in text form. The second was from Megan. I'm sorry it took this long. I'm proud of you. I read that one twice. An hour later, my grandmother texted, Next time, I want to sit on that porch with tea and see the ocean. That was the message that made my throat tighten. Over the following weeks, the truth spread through the family the way it always does once somebody breaks a long pattern in public. Relatives called. Questions came in. Curiosity replaced assumption. Some people clearly wanted gossip. Others sounded genuinely ashamed that they had accepted my mother's version of me for so long. What mattered wasn't the gossip itself. It was the shift. People started speaking to me directly, asking about my business, asking about the house, asking when they could visit, which I ignored selectively. My sister posted a few brittle things online about people who can't just celebrate others, and the difference between attention seeking and quiet confidence, which might have been funny if they weren't so transparent. My mother tried several times to recast Christmas as an unfortunate misunderstanding. I didn't allow it. I didn't fight. I just refused the rewrite. That spring, my grandmother visited exactly as promised. She sat on the repaired porch with a blanket over her knees, looked out toward the water, and said, "This house feels like you. Solid, thoughtful, strong where it counts." Then she walked through the workshop, touched the long table I'd restored, and smiled with a pride that had no agenda attached to it. Not pride because I had finally become impressive enough. Pride because I had become fully myself and stayed there. My relationship with my mother never returned to what it was before, and that is not a tragedy. Some bonds only feel close because one person is constantly swallowing what hurts. Remove that habit, and the relationship looks different very quickly. Vanessa and I became polite in a colder, clearer way. Megan and I got closer. My father remained what he had always been, late to honesty but not immune to it. And me? I stopped waiting to be translated correctly by people who preferred me simplified. So here is what I know now. Settling down is not a performance. It is not a floor plan someone else approves of. It is not a milestone that photographs well over Christmas dinner. It is not becoming legible to the people who only respect one type of life. Sometimes settling down means choosing the weather-beaten property everyone else dismisses because you know how to see structure beneath damage. Sometimes it means protecting your joy until it has enough roots to survive being doubted. Sometimes it means building quietly, so the first time they see what you've created, they can no longer interrupt it halfway through. And sometimes the most powerful revenge is not humiliating the people who misjudged you. It is answering them so calmly, so truthfully, and from such a solid place that their entire version of you collapses under its own arrogance. That Christmas, my mother thought she was asking when I would finally begin my adult life. What she didn't know was that I had already begun months earlier with a set of keys in my hand and no intention of asking permission. By the time she tried to measure me again, I was already standing inside a life she could no longer define. I wasn't late. I wasn't lost. I wasn't unfinished. I was simply building somewhere they had never bothered to look. And once they finally did, the person left frozen in shock wasn't me. It was the family that had confused underestimating me with knowing me,